He gambled away my life savings of $40,000 on illicit poker games. After that, he begged me for additional money so he could settle his bills. He lost his mind after I declined. After grabbing my hair and tying me to a chair, he showered me with salt water and then left me to fend for myself. Despite my fears, I refused to let him triumph. I devised a strategy the following day. I was prepared to deliver the shock of his life, and he had no clue what was coming. Isabella Grant here, and I can honestly say that I had no idea how my life would turn out. Austin, Texas is where I call home. I'm 32 years old. My name is Sarah, and I'm a teacher. My kid Ethan is 6 years old, and he's fantastic. It was only a matter of time before things looked ideal. I was under the impression that my future with David would be filled with love and joy. Not because it's an easy narrative to tell, but because I want people to have the strength to survive, preserve what's important, and start again after what happened to them. The way David and I crossed paths seemed like something out of a fairy tale. He radiated vitality, was considerate, and delightful to be around. I lived up to him as a contractor because of how hard he worked. I fell head over heels for him during our year-long romance. He gave me a sense of being unique and important, as if I were the only person on Earth. Shortly thereafter, we tied the knot, and our lovely son Ethan was born into this world. Everything looked great. Our home was beautiful, and I truly believed that we were creating something extraordinary in this partnership. For a long time, I thought our family was firmly founded on love and stability. Things began to shift, though, as time progressed. After we were married, David was a different man. There were subtle hints, things I attempted to ignore, but eventually it became clear. He started to ignore my emotions and take charge of our relationship. The tiny things he would say when he got home from work would make me feel insignificant. What gives with a filthy house? Alternatively, just what do you do all day? No matter how meticulously I attempted to maintain order, his incisive tone ensured that it was never satisfactory. Every time I attempted to confront him about the pain his remarks caused, he dismissed me, claiming I was overly sensitive or that I failed to comprehend the immense strain he was experiencing. I attempted to find an explanation. In my mind, he might simply be experiencing work-related stress. Perhaps I ought to have concentrated more, but it seemed like I was becoming less and less of myself every day. Our marriage had shifted to the point where I felt like an afterthought. Being at home made me feel confined. When Eric, David's younger brother, began dropping by more frequently, things quickly escalated. Despite being 24 years old, Eric has not yet found his life's purpose. Because he is unemployed, he frequently needed David's help. Unannounced, he would drop by our house and remain for hours, or even days, if he wanted to. David would constantly stand up for him whenever he brought up his issues. David would ignore me every time I tried to explain to him how overwhelmed and neglected I was feeling because of Eric. Saying, "He's family," David would assure us, "We must lend him a hand." Living in this place made me feel like nobody cared about me or my needs. No one ever paid attention to me, therefore I was always putting other people's needs before my own. For some reason, I no longer felt like David's wife. The affection we had was fading away as I felt relegated to the role of house servant. Eventually, a turning point arrived. To my surprise, I learned that David had become dependent on gambling, more especially on playing underground poker games illegally. I was initially unaware of its complete scope. I didn't give a second thought whenever he brought up the idea of playing poker with his pals. Then I found a bank statement and saw a massive withdrawal, $1,400 gone. Those funds were meant to be put toward Ethan's future, his education, and our safety. It was unbelievable to me. A sickening feeling washed over me. Can you tell me how David managed to pull this off? I wasn't expecting his reaction when I challenged him about it. He showed no signs of regret. But he wanted more money instead. I needed to pay off the guys I owe, he added, as if his request were completely reasonable. There was no way I could give him any more cash, though. I wouldn't stand by and watch him bring us down any lower. Anger like I had never seen from David before burst out when I said no. His temper flared that night. In his enraged eyes, he yoked me to a chair by a rope. His hostile expression on his face will stay with me forever. He emptied a pail of briny water on me. In comparison to the terror that seized my heart, the salt's sting was insignificant. "Isabella, please hand over the cash," he repeatedly yelled out. No, I was unable to. You can't expect me to. I was frightened for both Ethan and myself. How did he perceive this life? David, what sort of dad was he turning into? I had to figure out how to get out of there right then. For the sake of both my son and myself, I had to take precautions. The question is how. Or so David believed. I was bound to a chair, drenched and helpless. My resolve outweighed the terror that gripped me. I ignored the agony as I twisted and pulled against the restraints, determined to break free. Leaving was my only option. And then it occurred. I was able to liberate one hand as the knot became less tight. Still, that was just the start. My heart was racing when I finally severed my hand from the rope. Time seemed to stand still. David could re-enter the room at any second, and I couldn't predict his reaction if he caught sight of me attempting to flee. Still, I refused to let terror rule my life any longer. I couldn't stop now. To get myself out of the chair, I used my free hand to untee the second knot around my wrist. My legs trembled as I stood up, but I couldn't let myself dwell on the agony or the terror. The only thing on my mind was rescuing Ethan and escaping. I hastened to Ethan's bedroom. As a result of his fear and confusion, my young boy had taken cover. Looking up at me, his eyes were full with tears as I opened the door. "What on earth is going on, Mommy?" His little voice quivered as he whispered. Keeping my composure was an absolute struggle, but I knew it was necessary for his sake. Scooping him up in my arms, I whispered, "We're leaving, sweetheart. We will be completely protected." Afterwards, it was as if time had stood still. I emptied a little bag into which I tossed some clothing for us both, and Eden's cherished stuffed bear, his favorite toy. I was on the verge of losing control of my shaking hands because I kept expecting David to storm in the door at any second. In the next room, he was still yelling at himself, clearly quite angry. I was aware, though, that I could get away before he caught on to my scheme. Quietly, I snuck out the back door, carrying Ethan and our small bag of belongings. I persisted despite the biting night air. Just couldn't. A quick trip to the car was in order. As my hands trembled from dread and adrenaline, my heart raced as I clumsily punched keys. After a long struggle, I managed to unlock the door and secure Ethan into his seat. He was cradling his teddy in his small hands. The automobile was dead silent as I drove away from the house, but my thoughts were racing at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Anger, terror, and the crushing knowledge that I couldn't turn back the clock after what had transpired were all a part of it. This was it, I thought. My time with David was up. The next time something similar may happen, or even worse, if I didn't. I thought Ethan and I'd both deserved better. It took me around half an hour to drive to my folks' place. The 30 minutes seemed like hours. Overwhelmed by the thought that David may pursue us, I found myself fixated on the rearview mirror. Still, we succeeded. The sight of my parents' house brought a tiny feeling of relief when we eventually arrived at their house. With a worried expression on her face, my mom opened the door as soon as we arrived. "What occurred, Isabella?" when she drew me into a bear hug and requested. My strength crumbled under the embrace of her arms. The tears just wouldn't stop falling. I spilled the beans to her about David's gaming, his financial losses, and his climax, in which he tied me up and threw water on me as a demand for more money. My father, who had been quietly pacing, halted his movements upon hearing that final portion. His placid demeanor belied the rage I saw in his eyes as he drew Ethan and me closer. "You're staying here," my dad declared with an unwavering tone that left no opportunity for debate. "From now on, David will avoid you at all costs." Having my parents as a safety net was comforting, but it wasn't enough. David would find me no matter what. To ensure Aiken's and my own safety in the long run, I had to do something. I slept poorly that night, but when I woke up the following morning, everything was crystal clear. A lawyer was an absolute necessity, and I was determined to prevent David from ever harming us again. In light of this, I contacted family law expert Julie Morgan and scheduled a consultation. Despite her kindness, Julie was direct and to the point. She wasted no time responding once I informed her what had transpired. I was able to get full custody of Ethan and get a divorce with her assistance. However, I was certain that wouldn't suffice. We were in danger because of David's gambling problem, and I wanted proof of it. After that, I decided to use the services of a private investigator. Discovering David's level of involvement in the underground poker scene was the investigator's straightforward mission. I required evidence immediately. The detective probed David's whereabouts and actions throughout the following several days. Despite my best efforts, the passing of each hour seemed like an eternity. What would happen if David found out I was constructing evidence against him? That thought kept popping into my head. The detective returned with the precise information I required, though not long after. A covert recording of David cheating in one of his poker games was captured by him. This proved that David was involved in illicit gambling and revealed his character as a careless and deceitful individual. I required this proof. An odd combination of dread and relief washed over me. I finally felt like I could be in charge of my life again, even though the toughest part was yet to come. It was now up to me to collect the proof, and David would eventually have to pay for his crimes. I felt a ray of optimism when I had the private investigator's proof in my hands. The true struggle, though, was only about to start, and I knew it. Without delay, my attorney, Julie Morgan, began constructing the case against David. To keep Ethan and me safe, she was meticulous, perceptive, and understood her way around the system. Most significantly, we started getting ready for the criminal charges that David would soon face, as well as for the divorce and complete custody of Ethan. The proof we possessed was substantial. David had cheated at those underground poker games and gambled away $40,000 that should have gone toward our son's future. With this and the evidence of the abuse I had suffered, Julie told me my case would be strong. Despite having all of this working in our favor, I remained frightened. My worst fear was going up against David in court. Everything about that night lingered in my mind. The saline water, the rope, and the terror on Ethan's face. My stomach turned at the mere idea of seeing David's face again. The cops were also getting involved at this point. The authorities were able to accuse David with illegal gambling, fraud, and domestic abuse thanks to the investigators' recordings. They didn't waste any time, and David was in jail a few days later. The instant the news broke, I will never forget it. The call came in while my mother was seated next to me. The news that David has been taken into custody brought a tidal surge of mixed feelings, relief, dread, and wrath. It was a step in the right direction, but I still had a long way to go before I could be safe. I did my best to mentally and emotionally prepare myself for the trial as the date drew near. Remembering that this was for Ethan was a constant struggle for me. I have to keep him safe. Thanks to Julie's reassurances and the unwavering support of my parents, I knew we had a strong case. However, the terror persisted despite that. I hardly slept the night before my trial. Everything that had transpired was resonating with me, from the pleasant times when David and I were together to the gradual disintegration of our relationship. On the day of the trial, we entered the courthouse, and my heart raced with anticipation. For the first time since the night of my escape, I saw David, and I recall holding my breath. Even though he appeared unkempt, the icy rage that had marked him before remained in his gaze. I refrained from staring at him for an extended period of time as he sat with his attorney. Telling the truth was my only option, and I kept my mind on Julie. Our case was presented by Julie with great precision. She began by detailing David's financial woes, including his gambling addiction, bankruptcies, and lost wages. Subsequently, she presented the recordings, proof of his cheating during the poker games. As the specifics of his unlawful actions were presented to the jury, they listened intently. However, it was not all. Julie informed the court about the abuse. The bruise pictures, the police reports I had filled out, and the details of the night David had bound me to that chair were all laid out for me by her. Reliving it all in front of so many people was awkward. I was aware that all eyes were on me, yet I remained steadfast. Here was my opportunity to defend Ethan and myself, I thought to myself. Everything was downplayed, David's lawyer said. He said David's gambling was a phase, he never meant to hurt me, and I was making the abuse seem worse. However, there was an excessive amount of proof. It seems like they were attempting to shift blame with every statement made by his lawyer. However, the reality could not be ignored. At last, I was called upon to give my testimony. Despite the trembling in my palms, I knew I had to stand firm. I spoke into detail about how David had transformed over time, becoming increasingly domineering and emotionally distant. I went into detail about how terrified I was that night, how he bound me and poured salt water over me while he demanded money that I couldn't pay. I broke my silence in court by explaining that I had to stand up for Ethan and myself, and that I had to flee for our safety. After I spoke, there was complete quiet in the courtroom. I felt the tension in the room, but I dared not glance at David. Before releasing me from court, the judge sat silently for a while. Returning to my seat, I experienced a feeling of relief. It was done. My narrative had been told. The only thing left for me to do was await the decision. The part that was most difficult was waiting. My thoughts were racing as I sat in the courtroom following my testimony. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had said and whether or not it had been successful. It was essential that I have shared the most private aspects of my life with complete strangers. Ethan needed me to shield him from harm, and David needed me to make sure he paid for his actions. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury finally came back. The judge's reading of the verdict sent my heart racing. You might have heard a pin drop in that dead, silent courtroom. David sat across the room, expressionless, but I could feel the rage building up inside. I knew the truth, even though he was skilled at hiding it in public. The sound of the judge's words pierced my train of thought. I am guilty. Domestic violence, fraud, and unlawful gambling were all charges against David. An overwhelming sense of relief engulfed me. David was handed an 8-year prison term by the judge. A period of 8 years. Although it was brief, it was sufficient. Plenty of time for me and Ethan to begin over. Long enough to allow us to recover. While David was in jail, he was ordered to have no contact with Ethan, and I was given complete custody. Emotions of both relief and anguish surged through my heart. A mix of melancholy and relief at finally being free from our shackles. As the gravity of his situation hit, David did not respond at first, but instead sat still, facing forward. However, I looked away from him. Now I needed to focus on my own life and future. My parents were outside, waiting for me as the court procedures came to a close. Despite keeping his composure through it all, my father's eyes welled up with tears as he embraced me tightly. A mumble of "it's over" escaped me as my voice quivered with passion. "You accomplished it, Isabella," my mother remarked as she held my hand. "You battled for both yourself and Ethan." Things started to change in the weeks that followed. Despite the length of time it took to finalize the divorce paperwork, I was confident that it was the best course of action. While I looked for a new place for Ethan and me to live, we stayed with my parents. Somewhere new, free of the weight of the past, would have given me the start I needed. A cute little flat close to my parents' house was my final destination. There wasn't much, but it was ours, and Ethan and I felt comfortable there. A new chapter had begun in our life with the move into that flat. At first, I didn't see much beyond the stark walls and empty rooms. Then, as we started to unpack, I started to see it as our new home. I made sure to use Ethan's preferred colors when decorating his room. We arranged his books and toys on the shelf and hung up pictures of him. His laughter echoed across the room, and I finally felt at ease after what seemed like an eternity. It was the same for Ethan. He started to thrive after we were no longer plagued by the anxiety and stress. At school, he became more gregarious, played more, and even made some new friends. I felt like all my struggles were worthwhile when I watched him succeed. Moreover, a group for victims of domestic violence provided me with invaluable assistance. Surrounded by ladies who could relate to what I was going through, I found unexpected support. We conveyed our experiences, our sorrow, and our aspirations. I was comforted to know that there were people who could relate to the difficulty of picking oneself up after a tragedy like this. I found my inner fortitude via such relationships. I settled into a new pattern as the years went by. I returned to my beloved profession as a teacher, which provided me with the security I required to care for Ethan. In case I ever needed their assistance, my parents were never far away. Without them, I would not have survived. The district attorney's office sent me a letter one day. The denial of David's appeal of his punishment was a disappointment. The original verdict had been affirmed by the court system. The full term of David's sentence would be served. Sitting with the letter, I felt a wave of relief as it brought me closure. I had finally found peace, and the story with David was finally done. After a while, I stopped worrying about what the day would hold. The thought of David's next move no longer troubled me. The fact that Ethan and I were unharmed was the most important thing. I couldn't help but notice how far we've gone when I considered everything that transpired. We have grown beyond the anguish, terror, and hardship that once defined us. They are now only chapters in our tale. We have progressed. My life is back on track, and what's even more important is that I've made plans for a prosperous future for Ethan and myself. It was worth the struggle, though. I have transformed from a mere victim into a survivor, and that is something that